Good evening, everyone. Well, it's time for our Wednesday night lesson, and we're in the book of 1 Corinthians. We'll be looking at chapter 2 tonight. We finished chapter 1 after an introduction, and we'll go from there. We'll end up going through every chapter in the 1 Corinthians and then probably move on to 2 Corinthians. This is all very valuable information, and it's things that'll be beneficial to us in our everyday Christian lives. So, chapter 2, the objectives in studying this chapter: to appreciate Paul's method of proclaiming the gospel, and to see the need for inspiration and understanding the process by which it took place. Now, to summarize the chapter, he is continuing to demonstrate the folly of boasting in human wisdom. Paul reminds them of how he came to them. Instead of depending on excellent speech or persuasive words of wisdom, he proclaimed Jesus Christ and Him crucified, confirming his testimony with a demonstration of the Spirit and power. And that's the first 4 verses. As he did that, their faith might rest in God's power, not in the wisdom of men. Now, this had been a problem in the Corinthian church, too much human involvement in deciding things and not enough on the scriptures. He did proclaim a type of wisdom, however, the wisdom which comes from God, and that's verses 6 through 9. He then describes the process by which God has revealed his wisdom through his Spirit. That's verses 10 through 13. Then Paul contrasts the difference between the natural man, one who depends on his own human wisdom, who does not receive the things of the Spirit, and the spiritual man, one led by the Spirit of God, such as Paul, who has the mind of Christ. And that's verses 14 through 16. So we'll go on to the outline of the chapter, more or less going through it verse by verse. So the first 5 verses talk about the manner of Paul's preaching. He preached Jesus Christ and Him crucified. First verse, he declared the testimony of God without excellence of speech or wisdom. In verse 2, it was determined not to do anything among them but Jesus and Jesus crucified. That was it. Not to know anything among them but Jesus and Him crucified. And verse 3, done in weakness, fear, and much trembling. So, and this is a respectful and learning attitude, not a haughtiness or anything like that. Next, it deals with the demonstration of the power of the Spirit and of the power, and that's verses 4 and 5. Not persuaded with words of human wisdom, that their faith would rest in the power of God, not in the wisdom of men. And this is very important. Next, it talks about the true wisdom of God. That's verses 6 through 16. The hidden nature of God's wisdom, in verses 6 through 9. The apostles do speak a sort of wisdom among them who are mature, but it is not the wisdom of this age or its rulers which is coming to nothing. The wisdom of God they speak has been a mystery, and then verses 7 through 9. It was ordained before time began, but it was hidden. It was unknown to the rulers of this age, which is why they crucified the Lord. They didn't have the wisdom, so they made the mistake of crucifying the Lord. It was something that was eventually needed to be done, but because of their lack of knowledge is why it actually occurred. Man had not discovered what God had prepared for those who love Him. And next, in verses 10 through 13, the Spirit's revelation of God's wisdom. God's wisdom is revealed through His Spirit. The Spirit searches for the deep things of God, in verse 10, and only the Spirit of God can know the things of God. So all wisdom comes from God and through the Spirit. It was made known to the apostles, that's verse 12, who had received this Spirit from God, so they might know the things freely given by God. All wisdom and knowledge comes from God. They're spoken now by the apostles. This is verse 13. And they are not spoken in words according to human wisdom, but by the words taught by the Spirit, comparing spiritual things with spiritual things, not worldly things. Then in verses 14 through 16, it talks about the natural man versus the spiritual man. And I'll tell you what, today there's a lot of the natural man out there and very little of the spiritual man. Now the natural man, and that's basically the worldly philosopher, does not receive the things of the Spirit of God. Without a belief and understanding in God, you're not going to learn the things of God. Without the Spirit in you, there will be no godly learning. They are foolish in Him because they are spiritually discerned. Now, when it comes to the spiritual man, such as the apostles, this is not the case. He is able to judge all things properly. No one is able to properly judge him, for he has the mind of Christ. You stop and think about it. We can have the same thing as they did. If we have the mind of Christ, no one is really properly able to judge us except those who are also spiritual men. In other words, we're not really going to seem to be necessarily like normal people with the way the world thinks, with the way the minds think out there now. If we have the Spirit of God and the mind of Christ, we're liable to be considered somewhat different. So, that's chapter 2. Now let's look at some of the questions for the chapter, and we'll review the questions and then deal with the answers, or talk about the answers. List the main points of this chapter. The first 5 verses deal with the manner of Paul's preaching, and the rest of the chapter focuses on the important thing, which is the true wisdom of God, not the wisdom of man. Number 2, how does Paul describe his preaching among them? This is the first 2 verses. Not with excellence of speech or of wisdom. He was determined to preach only Jesus and Jesus crucified. Not his words, but the words of the Spirit. Question number 3, how does Paul describe his feelings among them? And this is verse 3. He describes his feelings as in weakness, in fear, and in much trembling. This is a very humble way of looking at things, not a boastful thing, not a prideful thing, but humble. Question number 4. What accompanied Paul as he preached the gospel? This is verse 4. He was accompanied by the demonstration of the Spirit and of power. He was given everything he needed to do what he needed to do through the Spirit. Number 5, what 6 phrases in verses 9 through 13 help to explain the process by which the hidden mystery of God is made known? And here they are. This is verses 9 through 13. Things which God prepared, God has revealed through His Spirit. We have received the Spirit that we might know the things freely given to us of God. These things we also speak, and in words which the Spirit teaches. That entire set of verses talks about everything we get from God and not from men. That's the focus of this whole chapter. Don't listen to men, listen to the Spirit, listen to the Scriptures, listen to what is being taught to you by people who have the Spirit within them. What phrase teaches the concept of verbal inspiration? And this is verse 13 we're looking at. Not in words which man's wisdom teaches, but which the Holy Spirit teaches, comparing spiritual things with spiritual. Get the world out of your lives when it comes to your religious world, and pretty much your world in general. Focus on spiritual things. Number 7, what is said about the natural man? This is the worldly man. This is the philosophers of the time, and the philosophers of this time too. Excuse me. This is verse 14. Do not receive the things of the Spirit of God. Oh no, the natural man does not receive the things of the Spirit of God. They are foolishness to him. He cannot know them, for they are spiritually discerned. In other words, his ability to learn and understand is not there. Without the Spirit guiding you, you can't understand it. You really have no real way of understanding what's going on with the Spirit of God. Question 8, the last question. And what is said about the spiritual man? And this is verses 15 and 16. The spiritual man is able to judge all things. And if he is a spiritual man, none can rightly judge him. If he's a spiritual man, he has the mind of Christ. So in order to have the mind of Christ, we need to be spiritual. And that's what the focus of this chapter is. Get away from the worldly things, get involved with the spiritual things, and your life will be a lot better, a lot easier, a lot more productive, and definitely have a much better ending with being able to spend eternity in heaven with God. So thank you for this. This is chapter 2. Next week we'll go on to chapter 3. It'll be an interesting study, and I hope you stay with us and get every chance you get to learn more about the gospel and strengthen your spiritual beliefs and your spiritual life. Thank you very much. Have a great evening. God bless you.